Welcome to today's Triple Z. The Triple Z podcast is a daily program that you can use to help you fall asleep each night. Just turn down the volume, lay back, relax, and enjoy as you fall asleep. We saw that our podcast was topping the charts in New Zealand, so we are going to read their Wikipedia entry. Let's learn about this interesting country in the dullest way possible. If you enjoy our program, please be sure to write us a review on your podcast platform and share us with a friend. You both might sleep just a little better at night. Our website is Triple Z, that's 3zs.media. You can also like and share our content on Facebook or our Instagram account ZZZ Media Podcast. Music for today's episode was provided by the Sleep channel on Spotify. New Zealand is an island country in the southwestern Pacific Ocean. It consists of two main landmasses, the North Island, Te Aikea-Maui, and the South Island, Te Waipounamu, and over 700 smaller islands. It is the sixth largest island country by area, covering 268,021 square kilometers, 103,500 square miles. New Zealand is about 2,000 kilometers, 1,200 miles, east of Australia across the Tasman Sea and 1,000 kilometers, 600 miles, south of the islands of New Caledonia, Fiji, and Tonga. The country's varied topography and sharp mountain peaks, including the Southern Alps, owe much to tectonic uplift and volcanic eruptions. New Zealand's capital city is Wellington, and its most populous city is Auckland. The islands of New Zealand were the last large habitable land to be settled by humans. Between about 1280 and 1350, Polynesians began to settle in the islands and then developed a distinctive Maori culture. In 1642, the Dutch explorer Abel Tasman became the first European to sight and record New Zealand. In 1840, representatives of the United Kingdom and Maori chiefs signed the Treaty of Waitangi, which in its English version declared British sovereignty over the islands. In 1841, New Zealand became a colony within the British Empire. Subsequently, a series of conflicts between the colonial government and Maori tribes resulted in the alienation and confiscation of large amounts of Maori land. New Zealand became a dominion in 1907. It gained full statutory independence in 1947, retaining the monarch as head of state. Today, the majority of New Zealand's population of 5.1 million is of European descent. The indigenous Maori are the largest minority, followed by Asians and Pacific Islanders. Reflecting this, New Zealand's culture is mainly derived from Maori and early British settlers, with recent broadening of culture arising from increased immigration. The official languages are English, Maori, and New Zealand Sign Language, with the local dialect of English being dominant. A developed country, New Zealand ranks highly in international comparisons of national performance, such as quality of life, education, protection of civil liberties, government transparency, and economic freedom. The country was the first to introduce a minimum wage and the first to give women the right to vote. New Zealand underwent major economic changes during the 1980s, which transformed it from a protectionist to a liberalized free trade economy. The service sector dominates the national economy, followed by the industrial sector and agriculture. International tourism is also a significant source of revenue. Nationally, legislative authority is vested in an elected, unicameral parliament, while executive political power is exercised by the cabinet, led by the Prime Minister, currently Chris Hipkins. Charles III is the country's king and is represented by the Governor-General. In addition, New Zealand is organized into 11 regional councils and 67 territorial authorities for local government purposes. The realm of New Zealand also includes Tokelau, a dependent territory, the Cook Islands and Niue, self-governing states in free association with New Zealand, and the Ross Dependency, which is New Zealand's territorial claim in Antarctica. New Zealand is a member of the United Nations, Commonwealth of Nations, ANZUS, UKUSA, OECD, ASEAN Plus 6, Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, the Pacific Community and the Pacific Islands Forum. The first European visitor to New Zealand, Dutch explorer Abel Tasman, named the island Staten Land, believing they were part of the Staten Land that Jacob Lemaire had sighted off the southern end of South America. Hendrik Brouwer proved that the South American land was a small island in 1643, and Dutch cartographers subsequently renamed Tasman's discovery Nova Zealandia from Latin after the Dutch province of Zeeland. This name was later anglicized to New Zealand. This was written as New Tirene in the Maori language. In 1834, a document written in Maori and entitled Hiwakapatanga o Te Rangitirtanga o New Tirene was translated into English and became the Declaration of the Independence of New Zealand. It was prepared by T.W.H. Akamaninga o Ngā Rangitirtanga o Ngā Apu o New Tirene, the United Tribes of New Zealand, and a copy was sent to King William IV, who had already acknowledged the flag of the United Tribes of New Zealand and who recognized the declaration in a letter from Lord Glenelg. Aotearoa, often translated as Land of the Long White Cloud, is the current Maori name for New Zealand. It is unknown whether Maori had a name for the whole country before the arrival of Europeans. Aotearoa originally referred to just the North Island. Maori had several traditional names for the two main islands, including Te Aikea Maui, the fish of Maui, for the North Island, and Te Waipanamu, the waters of Greenstone, or Te Waka o Aoraki, the canoe of Aoraki, for the South Island. Early European maps labeled the islands North, North Island, Middle, South Island, and South, Stewart Island/Rakura. In 1830, mapmakers began to use North and South on their maps to distinguish the two largest islands, and by 1907, this was the accepted norm. The New Zealand Geographic Board discovered in 2009 that the names of the North Island and South Island had never been formalized, and names and alternative names were formalized in 2013. This set the names as North Island or Te Aikea Maui and South Island or Te Waipanamu. For each island, either its English or Maori name can be used, or both can be used together. Similarly, the Maori and English names for the whole country are sometimes used together, Aotearoa New Zealand. However, this has no official recognition. New Zealand was the last major landmass settled by humans. The story of Kupe as the first human to set foot on the New Zealand archipelago, accredited by most Maori iwi, is considered credible by historians. He is generally believed to have existed historically. Most histories claim that at a time approximately 40 generations ago, between 900 and 1200 AD, the more specific reasons for Kupe's semi-legendary journey and the migration of Maori in general is contested. It is thought by some historians that Hawaii and other Polynesian islands were experiencing considerable internal conflict at that time, which is thought to have caused an exodus from them. Some historians contest that this was because of the fallout from the 1257 Samalas eruption, which caused crop devastation globally and possibly helped trigger the Little Ice Age. Radiocarbon dating, evidence of deforestation, and mitochondrial DNA variability within Maori populations suggest that Eastern Polynesians first settled the New Zealand archipelago between 1250 and 1300, although newer archaeological and genetic research points to a date no earlier than about 1280, with at least the main settlement period between about 1320 and 1350, consistent with evidence based on genealogical traditions. This represented a culmination in a long series of voyages through the Pacific Islands. It is the broad consensus of historians that the settlement of New Zealand by Eastern Polynesians was planned and deliberate. Over the centuries that followed, the Polynesian settlers developed a distinct culture now known as Maori. The population formed different iwi, tribes, and hapu, subtribes, which would sometimes cooperate, sometimes compete, and sometimes fight against each other. At some point, a group of Maori migrated to Rikohu, now known as the Chatham Islands, where they developed their distinct Moriori culture. The Moriori population was all but wiped out between 1835 and 1862 in the Moriori genocide, largely because of Taranaki Maori invasion and enslavement in the 1830s, although European diseases also contributed. In 1862, only 101 survived, and the last known full-blooded Moriori died in 1933. In a hostile 1642 encounter between Gadi Tumatakokiri and Dutch explorer Abel Tasman's crew, 4 of Tasman's crew members were killed, and at least one Maori was hit by canister shot. Europeans did not revisit New Zealand until 1769, when British explorer James Cook mapped almost the entire coastline. Following Cook, New Zealand was visited by numerous European and North American whaling, sealing, and trading ships. They traded European food, metal tools, weapons, and other goods for timber, Maori food, artifacts, and water. The introduction of the potato and the musket transformed Maori agriculture and warfare. Potatoes provided a reliable food surplus, which enabled longer and more sustained military campaigns. The resulting intertribal musket wars encompassed over 600 battles between 1801 and 1840, killing 30,000 to 40,000 Maori. From the early 19th century, Christian missionaries began to settle New Zealand, eventually converting most of the Maori population. The Maori population declined to around 40% of its pre-contact level during the 19th century. Introduced diseases were the major factor. The British government appointed James Busby as British resident to New Zealand in 1832 following a petition from Northern Maori. His duties were to protect British commerce, mediate between the unruly Pakeha, European, settlers and Maori, and to apprehend escaped convicts. In 1835, following an announcement of impending French settlement by Charles de Thierry, the nebulous United Tribes of New Zealand sent a declaration of independence to King William IV of the United Kingdom asking for protection. Ongoing unrest, the proposed settlement of New Zealand by the New Zealand Company, which had already sent its first ship of surveyors to buy land from Maori, and the dubious legal standing of the Declaration of Independence prompted the Colonial Office to send Captain William Hobson to claim sovereignty for the United Kingdom and negotiate a treaty with the Maori. The Treaty of Waitangi was first signed in the Bay of Islands on February 6, 1840. In response to the New Zealand Company's attempts to establish an independent settlement in Wellington and French settlers purchasing land in Akaroa, Hobson declared British sovereignty over all of New Zealand on May 21, 1840, even though copies of the treaty were still circulating throughout the country for Maori to sign. With the signing of the treaty and declaration of sovereignty, the number of immigrants, particularly from the United Kingdom, began to increase. New Zealand was administered as part of the colony of New South Wales until becoming a separate Crown colony, the colony of New Zealand on May 3, 1841. Armed conflict began between the colonial government and Maori in 1843 with the Wairau Fray over land and disagreements over sovereignty. These conflicts, mainly in the North Island, saw thousands of imperial troops and the Royal Navy come to New Zealand and became known as the New Zealand Wars. Following these armed conflicts, large amounts of Maori land was confiscated by the government to meet settler demands. The colony gained a representative government in 1852, and the first parliament met in 1854. In 1856, the colony effectively became self-governing, gaining responsibility over all domestic matters, except native policy, which was granted in the mid-1860s. Following concerns that the South Island might form a separate colony, Premier Alfred Domett moved a resolution to transfer the capital from Auckland to a locality near Cook Strait. Wellington was chosen for its central location, with Parliament officially sitting there for the first time in 1865. In 1886, New Zealand annexed the volcanic Kermadec Islands, about 1,000 kilometers (620 miles) northeast of Auckland. Since 1937, the islands are uninhabited except for about 6 people at Roa Island Station. These islands put the northern border of New Zealand at 29 degrees south latitude. After the 1982 unclose, the islands contributed significantly to New Zealand's exclusive economic zone. In 1891, the Liberal Party came to power as the first organized political party. The Liberal government, led by Richard Seddon for most of its period in office, passed many important social and economic measures. In 1893, New Zealand was the first nation in the world to grant all women the right to vote, and in 1894 pioneered the adoption of compulsory arbitration between employers and unions. The Liberals also guaranteed a minimum wage in 1894, a world first. In 1907, at the request of the New Zealand Parliament, King Edward VII proclaimed New Zealand a dominion within the British Empire, reflecting its self-governing status. In 1947, the country adopted the Statute of Westminster, confirming that the British Parliament could no longer legislate for New Zealand without the consent of New Zealand. Early in the 20th century, New Zealand was involved in world affairs, fighting in the First and Second World Wars and suffering through the Great Depression. The Depression led to the election of the first Labour government and the establishment of a comprehensive welfare state and a protectionist economy. New Zealand experienced increasing prosperity following the Second World War, and Maori began to leave their traditional rural life and move to the cities in search of work. A Maori protest movement developed, which criticized Eurocentrism and worked for greater recognition of Maori culture and of the Treaty of Waitangi. In 1975, a Waitangi tribunal was set up to investigate alleged breaches of the treaty, and it was enabled to investigate historic grievances in 1985. The government has negotiated settlements of these grievances with many iwi, although Maori claims to the foreshore and seabed proved controversial in the 2000s. New Zealand is a constitutional monarchy with a parliamentary democracy, although its constitution is not codified. Charles III is the King of New Zealand and thus the head of state. The King is represented by the Governor-General, whom he appoints on the advice of the Prime Minister. The Governor-General can exercise the Crown's prerogative powers, such as reviewing cases of injustice and making appointments of ministers, ambassadors, and other key public officials, and in rare situations, the reserved powers, e.g., the power to dissolve Parliament or refuse the royal assent of a bill into law. The powers of the monarch and the Governor-General are limited by constitutional constraints, and they cannot normally be exercised without the advice of ministers. The New Zealand Parliament holds legislative power and consists of the King and the House of Representatives. It also included an upper house, the Legislative Council, until this was abolished in 1950. The supremacy of Parliament over the Crown and other government institutions was established in England by the Bill of Rights 1689 and has been ratified as law in New Zealand. The House of Representatives is democratically elected, and a government is formed from the party or coalition with a majority of seats. If no majority is formed, a minority government can be formed if support from other parties during confidence and supply votes is assured. The Governor-General appoints ministers under advice from the Prime Minister, who is by convention the parliamentary leader of the governing party or coalition. Cabinet, formed by ministers and led by the Prime Minister, is the highest policy-making body in government and responsible for deciding significant government actions. Members of Cabinet make major decisions collectively and are therefore collectively responsible for the consequences of these decisions. A parliamentary general election must be called no later than 3 years after the previous election. Almost all general elections between 1853 and 1993 were held under the first-past-the-post voting system. Since the 1996 election, a form of proportional representation called mixed-member proportional (MMP) has been used. Under the MMP system, each person has 2 votes. One is for a candidate standing in the voters' electorate, and the other is for a party. Based on the 2018 census data, there are 72 electorates, which includes 7 Maori electorates in which only Maori can optionally vote, and the remaining 48 of the 120 seats are assigned so that representation in Parliament reflects the party vote, with the threshold that a party must win at least one electorate or 5% of the total party vote before it is eligible for a seat. Elections since the 1930s have been dominated by 2 political parties, National and Labour. Between March 2005 and August 2006, New Zealand became the first country in the world in which all the highest offices in the land, head of state, Governor-General, Prime Minister, Speaker, and Chief Justice, were occupied simultaneously by women. The country has had 3 female prime ministers. The current prime minister, since January 25, 2023, is Chris Hipkins. New Zealand's judiciary, headed by the Chief Justice, includes the Supreme Court, Court of Appeal, the High Court, and subordinate courts. Judges and judicial officers are appointed non-politically and under strict rules regarding tenure to help maintain judicial independence. This theoretically allows the judiciary to interpret the law based solely on the legislation enacted by Parliament without other influences on their decisions. New Zealand is identified as one of the world's most stable and well-governed states. As of 2017, the country was ranked 4th in the strength of its democratic institutions and 1st in government transparency and lack of corruption. A 2017 human rights report by the U.S. Department of State noted that the New Zealand government generally respected the rights of individuals, but voiced concerns regarding the social status of the Maori population. New Zealand ranks highly for civic participation in the political process, with 82% voter turnout during recent elections, compared to an OECD average of 69%. Early colonial New Zealand allowed the British government to determine external trade and be responsible for foreign policy. The 1923 and 1926 imperial conferences decided that New Zealand should be allowed to negotiate its own political treaties, and the first commercial treaty was ratified in 1928 with Japan. On September 3, 1939, New Zealand allied itself with Britain and declared war on Germany, with Prime Minister Michael Joseph Savage proclaiming, "Where she goes, we go. Where she stands, we stand." In 1951, the United Kingdom became increasingly focused on its European interests, while New Zealand joined Australia and the United States in the ANZUS Security Treaty. The influence of the United States on New Zealand weakened following protests over the Vietnam War, the refusal of the United States to admonish France after the sinking of the Rainbow Warrior, disagreements over environmental and agricultural trade issues, and New Zealand's nuclear-free policy. Despite the United States' suspension of ANZUS obligations, the treaty remained in effect between New Zealand and Australia, whose foreign policy has followed a similar historical trend. Close political contact is maintained between the two countries, with free trade agreements and travel arrangements that allow citizens to visit, live and work in both countries without restrictions. In 2013, there were about 650,000 New Zealand citizens living in Australia, which is equivalent to 15% of the population of New Zealand. New Zealand has a strong presence among the Pacific Island countries. A large proportion of New Zealand's aid goes to these countries, and many Pacific people migrate to New Zealand for employment. Permanent migration is regulated under the 1970 Samoan Quota Scheme and the 2002 Pacific Access Category, which allow up to 1,100 Samoan nationals and up to 750 other Pacific Islanders respectively to become permanent New Zealand residents each year. A seasonal worker scheme for temporary migration was introduced in 2007, and in 2009 about 8,000 Pacific Islanders were employed under it. New Zealand is involved in the Pacific Islands Forum, the Pacific Community, Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations Regional Forum, including the East Asia Summit. New Zealand has been described as a middle power in the Asia-Pacific region and an emerging power. The country is a member of the United Nations, the Commonwealth of Nations, and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, and participates in the 5 power defense arrangements. New Zealand's military services, the Defence Force, comprise the New Zealand Army, the Royal New Zealand Air Force, and the Royal New Zealand Navy. New Zealand's national defense needs are modest since a direct attack is unlikely. However, its military has had a global presence. The country fought in both world wars, with notable campaigns in Gallipoli, Crete, El Alamein, and Cassino. The Gallipoli campaign played an important part in fostering New Zealand's national identity and strengthened the Anzac tradition it shares with Australia. In addition to Vietnam and the 2 world wars, New Zealand fought in the Second Boer War, the Korean War, the Malayan Emergency, the Gulf War, and the Afghanistan War. It has contributed forces to several regional and global peacekeeping missions, such as those in Cyprus, Somalia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Sinai, Angola, Cambodia, the Iran-Iraq border, Bougainville, East Timor, and the Solomon Islands. New Zealand is a member of the Five Eyes Intelligence Sharing Agreement, known formally as the AUKUSA Agreement. The 5 members of this agreement are Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and the United States. The early European settlers divided New Zealand into provinces, which had a degree of autonomy. Because of financial pressures and the desire to consolidate railways, education, land sales, and other policies, government was centralized and the provinces were abolished in 1876. The provinces are remembered in regional public holidays and sporting rivalries. Since 1876, various councils have administered local areas under legislation determined by the central government. In 1989, the government reorganized local government into the current two-tier structure of regional councils and territorial authorities. The 249 municipalities that existed in 1975 have now been consolidated into 67 territorial authorities and 11 regional councils. The regional council's role is to regulate the natural environment with particular emphasis on resource management, while territorial authorities are responsible for sewage, water, local roads, building consents, and other local matters. 5 of the territorial councils are unitary authorities and also act as regional councils. The territorial authorities consist of 13 city councils, 53 district councils, and the Chatham Islands Council. While officially the Chatham Islands Council is not a unitary authority, it undertakes many functions of a regional council. The realm of New Zealand, one of 15 Commonwealth realms, is the entire area over which the King of New Zealand is sovereign and comprises New Zealand, Tokelau, the Ross Dependency, the Cook Islands, and Niue. The Cook Islands and Niue are self-governing states in free association with New Zealand. The New Zealand Parliament cannot pass legislation for these countries, but with their consent can act on behalf of them in foreign affairs and defense. Tokelau is classified as a non-self-governing territory, but is administered by a council of 3 elders, 1 from each Tokelauan atoll. The Ross Dependency is New Zealand's territorial claim in Antarctica, where it operates the Scott-based research facility. New Zealand nationality law treats all parts of the realm equally, so most people born in New Zealand, the Cook Islands, Niue, Tokelau, and the Ross Dependency are New Zealand citizens. New Zealand is located near the center of the water hemisphere and is made up of 2 main islands and more than 700 smaller islands. The 2 main islands, the North Island, or Te Aikea Maui, and the South Island, or Te Waipounamu, are separated by Cook Strait, 22 kilometers, 14 miles, wide at its narrowest point. Besides the North and South Islands, the 5 largest inhabited islands are Stewart Island across the Foveaux Strait, Chatham Island, Great Barrier Island in the Hauraki Gulf, D'Urville Island in the Marlborough Sounds, and Waiheke Island, about 22 kilometers, 14 miles from central Auckland. New Zealand is long and narrow, over 1,600 kilometers, 990 miles, along its north-northeast axis with a maximum width of 400 kilometers, 250 miles, with about 15,000 kilometers, 9,300 miles, of coastline and a total land area of 268,000 square kilometers, 103,500 square miles. Because of its far-flung outlying islands and long coastline, the country has extensive marine resources. Its exclusive economic zone is one of the largest in the world, covering more than 15 times its land area. The South Island is the largest landmass of New Zealand. It is divided along its length by the Southern Alps. There are 18 peaks over 3,000 meters, 9,800 feet, the highest of which is Aoraki/Mount Cook at 3,724 meters, 12,218 feet. Fiordland's steep mountains and deep fjords record the extensive Ice Age glaciation of this southwestern corner of the South Island. The North Island is less mountainous but is marked by volcanism. The highly active Taupo volcanic zone has formed a large volcanic plateau, punctuated by the North Island's highest mountain, Mount Ruapehu, 2,797 meters, 9,177 feet. The plateau also hosts the country's largest lake, Lake Taupo, nestled in the caldera of one of the world's most active supervolcanoes. New Zealand is prone to earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. The country owes its very topography, and perhaps even its emergence above the waves, to the dynamic boundary it straddles between the Pacific and Indo-Australian plates. New Zealand is part of Zealandia, a microcontinent nearly half the size of Australia that gradually submerged after breaking away from the Gondwanan supercontinent. About 25 million years ago, a shift in plate tectonic movements began to contort and crumple the region. This is now most evident in the Southern Alps, formed by compression of the crust beside the Alpine Fault. Elsewhere, the plate boundary involves the subduction of one plate under the other, producing the Pisgah Trench to the south, the Ikurangi Trench east of the North Island, and the Kermadec and Tonga Trenches further north. New Zealand, together with Australia, is part of a region known as Australasia. It also forms the southwestern extremity of the geographic and ethnographic region called Polynesia. Oceania is a wider region encompassing the Australian continent, New Zealand, and various island countries in the Pacific Ocean that are not included in the seven-continent model. Landscapes of New Zealand. New Zealand's climate is predominantly temperate maritime, Köppen, CFB, with mean annual temperatures ranging from 10 degrees Celsius 50 degrees Fahrenheit in the south to 16 degrees Celsius 61 degrees Fahrenheit in the north. Historical maxima and minima are 42.4 degrees Celsius 108.32 degrees Fahrenheit in Rangiora, Canterbury, and minus 25.6 degrees Celsius minus 14.08 degrees Fahrenheit in Ranfurly, Otago. Conditions vary sharply across regions from extremely wet on the west coast of the South Island to semi-arid in central Otago and the Mackenzie Basin of inland Canterbury and subtropical in Northland. Of the 7 largest cities, Christchurch is the driest, receiving on average only 618 millimeters, 24.3 in, of rain per year, and Wellington the wettest, receiving almost twice that amount. Auckland, Wellington, and Christchurch all receive a yearly average of more than 2,000 hours of sunshine. The southern and southwestern parts of the South Island have a cooler and cloudier climate, with around 1,400 to 1,600 hours. The northern and northeastern parts of the South Island are the sunniest areas of the country and receive about 2,400 to 2,500 hours. The general snow season is early June until early October, though cold snaps can occur outside this season. Snowfall is common in the eastern and southern parts of the South Island and mountain areas across the country. New Zealand's geographic isolation for 80 million years and island biogeography has influenced evolution of the country's species of animals, fungi, and plants. Physical isolation has caused biological isolation, resulting in a dynamic evolutionary ecology with examples of distinctive plants and animals as well as populations of widespread species. The flora and fauna of New Zealand were originally thought to have originated from New Zealand's fragmentation off from Gondwana. However, more recent evidence postulates species resulted from dispersal. About 82% of New Zealand's indigenous vascular plants are endemic, covering 1,944 species across 65 genera. The number of fungi recorded from New Zealand, including lichen-forming species, is not known, nor is the proportion of those fungi which are endemic, but one estimate suggests there are about 2,300 species of lichen-forming fungi in New Zealand, and 40% of these are endemic. The two main types of forest are those dominated by broadleaf trees with emergent podocarps, or by southern beech in cooler climates. The remaining vegetation types consist of grasslands, the majority of which are tussock. Before the arrival of humans, an estimated 80% of the land was covered in forest, with only high alpine, wet, infertile, and volcanic areas without trees. Massive deforestation occurred after humans arrived, with around half the forest cover lost to fire after Polynesian settlement. Much of the remaining forest fell after European settlement, being logged or cleared to make room for pastoral farming, leaving forest occupying only 23% of the land. The forests were dominated by birds, and the lack of mammalian predators led to some like the kiwi, kakapo, weka, and takai evolving flightlessness. The arrival of humans, associated changes to habitat, and the introduction of rats, ferrets, and other mammals led to the extinction of many bird species, including large birds like the moa and haas eagle. Other indigenous animals are represented by reptiles, tuatara, skinks, and geckos, frogs, such as the protected endangered Hamilton's frog, spiders, insects, weta, and snails. Some, such as the tuatara, are so unique that they have been called living fossils. 3 species of bats, one since extinct, were the only sign of native land mammals in New Zealand until the 2006 discovery of bones from a unique, mouse-sized land mammal at least 16 million years old. Marine mammals, however, are abundant, with almost half the world's cetaceans, whales, dolphins, and porpoises, and large numbers of fur seals reported in New Zealand waters. Many seabirds breed in New Zealand, a third of them unique to the country. More penguin species are found in New Zealand than in any other country, with 13 of the world's 18 penguin species. Since human arrival, almost half of the country's vertebrate species have become extinct, including at least 51 birds, 3 frogs, 3 lizards, 1 freshwater fish, and 1 bat. Others are endangered or have had their range severely reduced. However, New Zealand conservationists have pioneered several methods to help threatened wildlife recover, including island sanctuaries, pest control, wildlife translocation, fostering an ecological restoration of islands and other protected areas. New Zealand has an advanced market economy, ranked 13th in the 2021 Human Development Index and 4th in the 2022 Index of Economic Freedom. It is a high-income economy with a nominal gross domestic product (GDP) per capita of $36,254. The currency is the New Zealand dollar, informally known as the Kiwi dollar. It also circulates in the Cook Islands, see Cook Islands dollar, Niue, Tokelau, and the Pitcairn Islands. Historically, extractive industries have contributed strongly to New Zealand's economy, focusing at different times on sealing, whaling, flax, gold, kauri gum, and native timber. The first shipment of refrigerated meat on the Dunedin in 1882 led to the establishment of meat and dairy exports to Britain, a trade which provided the basis for strong economic growth in New Zealand. High demand for agricultural products from the United Kingdom and the United States helped New Zealanders achieve higher living standards than both Australia and Western Europe in the 1950s and 1960s. In 1973, New Zealand's export market was reduced when the United Kingdom joined the European Economic Community, and other compounding factors, such as the 1973 oil and 1979 energy crises, led to a severe economic depression. Living standards in New Zealand fell behind those of Australia and Western Europe, and by 1982 New Zealand had the lowest per capita income of all the developed nations surveyed by the World Bank. In the mid-1980s, New Zealand deregulated its agricultural sector by phasing out subsidies over a 3-year period. Since 1984, successive governments engaged in major macroeconomic restructuring, known first as Reaganomics and then Euthanasia, rapidly transforming New Zealand from a protectionist and highly regulated economy to a liberalized free trade economy. Unemployment peaked just above 10% in 1991 and 1992, following the 1987 share market crash, but eventually fell to a record low since 1986 of 3.7% in 2007, ranking third from 27 comparable OECD nations. However, the global financial crisis that followed had a major impact on New Zealand, with the GDP shrinking for 5 consecutive quarters, the longest recession in over 30 years, and unemployment rising back to 7% in late 2009. Unemployment rates for different age groups follow similar trends but are consistently higher among youth. In the December 2014 quarter, the general unemployment rate was around 5.8%, while the unemployment rate for youth aged 15 to 21 was 15.6%. New Zealand has experienced a series of brain drains since the 1970s that still continue today. Nearly 1/4 of highly skilled workers live overseas, mostly in Australia and Britain, which is the largest proportion from any developed nation. In recent decades, however, a brain gain has brought in educated professionals from Europe and less developed countries. Today, New Zealand's economy benefits from a high level of innovation. New Zealand is heavily dependent on international trade, particularly in agricultural products. Exports account for 24% of its output, making New Zealand vulnerable to international commodity prices and global economic slowdowns. Food products made up 55% of the value of all the country's exports in 2014, which was the second largest earner, 7%. New Zealand's main trading partners, as of June 2018, are China, $27.8 billion New Zealand dollars, Australia, $26.2 billion, the European Union, $22.9 billion, the United States, $17.6 billion, and Japan, $8.4 billion. On April 7, 2008, New Zealand and China signed the New Zealand-China Free Trade Agreement, the first such agreement China has signed with a developed country. The service sector is the largest sector in the economy, followed by manufacturing and construction, and then farming and raw material extraction. Tourism plays a significant role in the economy, contributing $12.9 billion, or 5.6%, to New Zealand's total GDP and supporting 7.5% of the total workforce in 2016. In 2017, international visitor arrivals were expected to increase at a rate of 5.4% annually up to 2022. Wool was New Zealand's major agricultural export during the late 19th century. Even as late as the 1960s, it made up over a third of all export revenues, but since then its price has steadily dropped relative to other commodities, and wool is no longer profitable for many farmers. In contrast, dairy farming increased, with the number of dairy cows doubling between 1990 and 2007 to become New Zealand's largest export earner. In the year to June 2018, dairy products accounted for 17.7%, $14.1 billion, of total exports, and the country's largest company, Fonterra, controls almost 1/3 of the international dairy trade. Other exports in 2017 to 18 were meat, 8.8%, wood and wood products, 6.2%, fruit, 3.6%, machinery, 2.2%, and wine, 2.1%. New Zealand's wine industry has followed a similar trend to dairy, the number of vineyards doubling over the same period, overtaking wool exports for the first time in 2007. In 2015, renewable energy generated 40.1% of New Zealand's gross energy supply. The majority of the country's electricity supply is generated from hydroelectric power, with major schemes on the Waikato, Waitaki and Clutha/Mano rivers, as well as at Manapuri. Geothermal power is also a significant generator of electricity, with several large stations located across the Taupo volcanic zone in the North Island. The four main companies in the generation and retail market are Contact Energy, Genesis Energy, Mercury Energy, and Meridian Energy. State-owned Transpower operates the high-voltage transmission grids in the North and South Islands, as well as the inter-island HVDC link connecting the two together. The provision of water supply and sanitation is generally of good quality. Regional authorities provide water abstraction, treatment, and distribution infrastructure to most developed areas. New Zealand's transport network comprises 94,000 kilometers, 58,410 miles, of roads, including 199 kilometers, 124 miles, of motorways, and 4,128 kilometers, 2,565 miles, of railway lines. Most major cities and towns are linked by bus services, although the private car is the predominant mode of transport. The railways were privatized in 1993 but were renationalized by the government in stages between 2004 and 2008. The state-owned enterprise KiwiRail now operates the railways, with the exception of commuter services in Auckland and Wellington, which are operated by Auckland One Rail and Transdev Wellington respectively. Railways run the length of the country, although most lines now carry freight rather than passengers. The road and rail networks in the two main islands are linked by roll-on/roll-off ferries between Wellington and Picton, operated by Interislander, part of KiwiRail, and Bluebridge. Most international visitors arrive via air. New Zealand has 4 international airports: Auckland, Christchurch, Queenstown, and Wellington. However, only Auckland and Christchurch offer non-stop flights to countries other than Australia or Fiji. The New Zealand Post Office had a monopoly over telecommunications in New Zealand until 1987, when Telecom New Zealand was formed, initially as a state-owned enterprise and then privatized in 1990. Chorus, which was split from Telecom, now Spark, in 2011, still owns the majority of the telecommunications infrastructure, but competition from other providers has increased. A large-scale rollout of gigabit-capable fiber to the premises, branded as ultra-fast broadband, began in 2009 with a target of being available to 87% of the population by 2022. As of 2017, the United Nations International Telecommunication Union ranks New Zealand 13th in the development of information and communications infrastructure.